For this episode, I will be sharing a pretty short session at Park Vancouver. Just as my name was called and I was getting ready to sit down at my table, someone from the poker room yelled out my name. And at first, initially my thought was it was a friend or a regular or someone I knew. It turns out that it was someone that I was not previously acquainted with. That someone just said he really enjoys my vlogs. And yeah, it's just always such a treat to hear that. Not only is it flattering and a bit of an ego boost, but it's always nice to have some kind of assurance from time to time that some people out there actually do enjoy the videos that I make. So shout out to Terry. Thank you so much for that. It might not seem like it in person sometimes, but it actually means a lot. So something I want to share. And let's just jump into the hands. This hand, I pick up Jack 10 in the hijack position. The middle position limps. I raise it to $15 to either take it down or isolate and play in position. Everyone folds except for the limper, who calls. It's heads up into a flop of 10-9-7 with 2 diamonds. The villain checks to me. Very nice to hit top pair with a gut shot. I c-bet for $15. The villain calls. The turn is a 6 of diamonds. The villain checks again. Not a great card. Flush gets there, which I unblock. Open-ended straight draw gets there with an 8, and there are a lot of 8x hands in his limp calling range. I actually don't beat any 10x combos as well, so any value I go for is super thin for this board, I think. I might get calls from Queen King, Jack Queen, Jack King that peel to flop and maybe continue here with the diamond, but I'm not beating any value hands realistically. There's no weaker 10x hand that makes sense and would call a turn. I check back. The river is the 8 of diamonds. The villain checks again. Another card that makes the board even more connected. I have the high straight, which is nice for showdown, but don't think I'm ever getting paid off by worse hands with 4 to a flush out there. If I bet, it would only be to fold out medium diamonds or get calls from bluff catching hands. Without any solid reads yet at this table, I'm just going to assume for now the players aren't capable of doing either of those. I check back for a showdown. I table my hand and the villain mucks. This hand, I pick up pocket queens in the small blind. The low jack, hijack, and cutoff limps. I raise it to $25. Everyone folds except for the low jack, who calls. It's heads up into a flop of 4-7-6, all spades. I do have the queen of spades, which is nice, but with a monotone board, I'm gonna pot control and start with a check. The villain checks back. The turn is an 8. This completes a straight for anyone with 5x. Even though the villain would have 5x more often than myself, we're both not that likely to have it here. So I decide to start betting for value now, just targeting one pair hands or maybe a random spade. I make a delayed c-bet of $15. The villain calls. The river is a 9. Now there are more one-card straight possibilities. I check and hope for a showdown, maybe beating ace of spades that would check back a lot here. The villain checks back. I table my hand and he mucks. This hand, I pick up pocket 10s at under the gun. There is a button straddle to $6. Both of the blinds fold. I open to $15. Everyone folds except for the button slash straddler, who calls. It's heads up into a flop of deuce-deuce-8 with 2 hearts. Pretty good flop for pocket 10s and a heart blocker. I c-bet for $10, mainly targeting 8x and weaker pocket pairs. The villain calls. The turn is another deuce. Awesome turn card, as it's way less likely for him to have a deuce, and all the value hands I was targeting makes a full house that's hard to get away from, namely 8x. I continue betting for value and make it $20. The villain calls. The river is a 7 of hearts. A flush also gets there, so if the villain did have a flush draw and decide to be sticky, it's now a pretty good bluff catching hand as well. I think there are a lot of hands to target for value, including all worst full houses and all flushes. I bet $60. Unfortunately, the villain folds. This hand, I pick up pocket jacks at under the gun +1. Under the gun limps, and I raise it to $15. Only the button and limper calls. It's three-way into a flop of King Queen 8 Rainbow. Under the gun checks to me. With 2 overcards to my pair, in a multi-way pot, I just check. The button checks back. The turn is a 7. Everyone checks again. I just don't see too much merit in taking a stab here, which would only be for value against 3rd and 4th pair. Just way too thin for a multi-way pot. I also block most of the straight draws, so not much more for me to protect against if I'm ahead. The river is a 6. Everyone checks once again, and we go to a showdown. I table my hand, and everyone mucks. This hand, I pick up Jack 7 of spades at the cutoff. Everyone folds to me, and I open to $10. Only the big blind defends. It's heads up into a flop of Ace 9-3 Rainbow. The villain checks. I completely miss, but with an ace high board, I just decide to c-bet my range. I make it $10. The villain calls. The turn is a 10. The villain checks again. I pick up a tiny bit of equity with a gut shot now, but with the villain calling the flop on a dry board, I don't think this is a good spot to keep up the aggression. I take a free card and check. The river is a 7. The villain checks again. I managed to hit a pair, not a good one, but got some showdown value. I'm not likely beating anything, but I'm also not turning my hand into a bluff because it's just too easy for anyone to call with any ace-x. I check and table my hand. The villain surprisingly mucks. I take this one down, not really knowing what I beat. This hand, I pick up Ace 5 on the button. There are 2 limpers, and I decide to raise it to $20 to try and pick up the dead money with an ace. Only the big blind calls. It's heads up into a flop of King 10-10 with 2 clubs. The villain checks. I c-bet for $15. The villain calls. The turn is a 9 of spades. The villain checks again. Not a good card, well, not a good board for my hand. Open-ended straight gets there. 10x is going nowhere. King X is also likely to be sticking around, especially if he has some kind of straight draw to go along with it. I just check back, basically waving the white flag here. The river is a 10. The villain checks again. Actually not a bad card. With this run out, I do beat some random flush draws with my ace high. So I just check for a showdown, hoping that's the case. The villain shows pocket 7s. Well played, sir. This hand, I pick up Queen Jack of spades in the hijack position. There is a button straddle of $6. The small blind calls. The big blind folds. There are 2 more callers before the action gets to me. Pretty nice looking hand, but I don't really want to play this hand out of position. I decide to raise it to $35. It would be nice to pick up the dead money now, but if we do go post-flop, I'm hoping the bet is also big enough to fold out the cutoff and button. The button calls, along with 2 others. It's 4-way into a flop of King Deuce 6 Rainbow, no spades. The action checks to me, and I just check in a multi-way pot that I completely miss. The button bets out $120. The small blind calls, +1 folds, and not much for me here, so I just make an easy laydown. This hand, I pick up Jack 9 at the cutoff. Under the gun +1 opens to $15. The middle position calls, the low jack calls, the hijack folds. This is not a great hand at all. In most cases, this is a fold pre-flop. But in a pretty passive game with not a lot of 3-bets and squeezes, I cold call this one with pretty good odds and position. Everyone else folds. It's 4-way into a flop of King 7-10 with 2 diamonds. +1 c-bets for $30. The middle position calls. The low jack also calls. I have a double gutter straight draw as well as just an awesome price. 8 would give me the nut straight. I call. The turn is a 9. +1 continues to lead out, this time for $65. The middle position calls and the low jack folds. This may seem like a good card, improving my hand into a pair and picking up some extra equity, but it's actually a pretty bad one because any river card that gives me a straight now would put a 4-liner to a straight on board, and that just basically kills my implied odds. I'm still getting pretty good pot odds to call with a pair and double gutter, but at this point, even my straight out has to be a non-diamond because surely one of them is on the flush draw, which I unblock. My jack does block the straight possibilities, and I'm thinking of the best way to rep that hand if I want to make that play. Flat calling would be out of the question with a flush draw on board. The middle position just never has a straight here with the cold call. So I decide to go for it. I jam all in. All I'm hoping for is to avoid the snap call with Jack Queen. +1 starts tanking, and that is very good news for me. I'm trying to tell the story that I have Jack Queen, and I think my line is pretty convincing, especially with a blocker. I also haven't showed down any nonsensical hands this session. The tanking continues, even if he has ace-king or something stronger that's not quite as straight. It's a super tough spot for him to be in. In my mind, obviously I'm rooting for him to fold, as I'm pretty certain once I get through him, the other villain can't really call. And he finds a fold, and then the other villain open folds King 9, a turn 2 pair. Everyone at the table is basically saying I obviously had Jack Queen, and I play along and nod in agreement as I take in the pot. This hand, I pick up Jack Queen at the cutoff. Everyone folds to me, and I open to $10. Only the big blind defends. It's heads up into a flop of King 7 Deuce Rainbow. The villain checks. I just c-bet for $10, repping all the King X in my range, and that's good enough to take it down. For this session, I bought in for $600 and cashed out with $685. That is a profit of $85. This brings my episode to an end. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.